yourself in the mirror. Really look. Now picture a chimpanzee standing next to you, a gorilla, an orangutan. Notice something strange? You're naked. Not clothing naked, biologically naked. Where they have thick coats of fur covering almost every inch of their bodies, you have bare skin. Smooth, exposed, vulnerable skin with just scattered patches of hair that barely do anything at all. This is weird. Really weird. And for over a century, scientists have been trying to figure out why. See, humans are mammals, and mammals have fur. That's kind of our thing. It's in the definition. The word mammal comes from mammary glands, sure, but if you ask most people what makes a mammal, they'd probably say fur or hair. Mice have it. Elephants have it. Whales have it. Or at least they did before they went back to the ocean. Even dolphins are born with little whiskers. Bats, bears, rabbits, lions. Every mammal you can think of is covered in the stuff except us. We've got about 5 million hair follicles on our bodies, which sounds like a lot until you realise that's roughly the same number as a chimpanzee. The difference, our hairs are tiny, thin, nearly invisible over most of our bodies. They're called vellus hairs, and they're essentially useless for everything fur is supposed to do. They don't keep us warm, they don't protect our skin from the sun, they don't shield us from thorns or insect bites. They just sit there, barely visible, like the evolutionary ghost of something we used to have. This nakedness makes us bizarre outliers in the mammal world. Sure, there are a few other mostly hairless mammals: elephants, rhinos, hippos, walruses, naked mole rats, whales. But notice something about that list. They're either huge and don't need fur for temperature regulation, or they live in water, or they live underground where fur would be a liability. They all have good reasons for losing their hair. But us? We're medium-sized land mammals who evolved in Africa and then spread to every climate on Earth. By all logic, we should have kept our fur. Our closest relatives, chimps and gorillas and bonobos, they're all still covered in thick hair. They live in the same kinds of environments our ancestors did. So what happened to us? Why did evolution strip away something as fundamentally useful as a fur coat? This is what zoologist Desmond Morris called the naked ape problem back in 1967, and it's been driving scientists crazy ever since. Because fur isn't just decoration, it's functional, critically functional. It insulates you from heat and cold. It protects your skin from UV radiation, from cuts and scrapes, from biting insects. It provides camouflage. It can even play a role in social signalling and mate selection. Losing all of that must have happened for a reason, a really good reason. Evolution doesn't just throw away useful adaptations on a whim. Every trait exists because it helps an organism survive and reproduce, or at least doesn't hurt their chances enough to get selected out. So somewhere in our evolutionary past, being naked became more advantageous than being hairy. The question is why. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read the comments and it's like Tokyo at dawn, London at lunch, Melbourne at midnight, all at once. Here's what makes this mystery even more fascinating. Nobody agrees on the answer, not even close. Over the past 100 years, scientists have proposed at least a dozen different theories about why humans lost their body hair. Some think it was about temperature regulation, that our ancestors needed to cool down while hunting in the hot African sun. Others believe it was about parasites, that losing our fur helped us get rid of disease-carrying lice and ticks. Some researchers even suggested we had an aquatic phase in our evolution, living partially in water like seals or otters. Then there's sexual selection. Maybe our ancestors just found naked skin attractive and chose mates accordingly, generation after generation, until hairlessness became the norm. Or perhaps it was all about technology. Maybe once our ancestors invented clothing and controlled fire, fur became redundant and evolution let it slip away. The truth? It's probably some combination of all these factors. evolution rarely works in simple single-cause ways. But figuring out which theories hold water and which ones don't requires us to go back millions of years to trace the evolutionary journey from our hairy ancestors to the naked apes we are today. Tonight, we're going to explore all of it. The Savanna hunts and the sweating hypothesis. The controversial aquatic ape theory that gets scientists either excited or furious depending on who you ask. The role of fire and clothing. The genetics that actually control hair growth and how they changed in our lineage. We'll look at why we kept hair in certain places, our heads, our armpits, our groin, and lost it everywhere else. And maybe, just maybe, by the end, we'll understand why we're standing here, naked among mammals, the strange hairless apes who inherited the earth. But first, we need to go back, way back, to see what we used to look like when we were still properly hairy. Close your eyes and picture East Africa around 6 or 7 million years ago. Not the Africa you know from documentaries with vast savannas and migrating herds. This Africa is different, wetter, greener. The continent is dominated by dense tropical forests that stretch for hundreds of miles, broken occasionally by rivers and clearings, but mostly just canopy. Thick, shadowy, humid canopy. In these forests live your ancestors, not humans yet, not even close. These are early hominins, creatures that had just recently split from the lineage that would become chimpanzees. They're small, probably standing maybe 3 or 4 feet tall when upright, which isn't often. They spend most of their time in the trees, moving through branches with a kind of clumsy efficiency, eating fruit, leaves, insects, whatever they can find. And they're covered in hair, completely covered. Dense, dark fur coats their arms, legs, backs, chests. Their faces have less hair, sure, but even there you'd see plenty of coverage. Imagine something between a chimpanzee and a young gorilla, not the sleek, groomed look of a modern human with a beard. We're talking thick, functional fur that does actual work. That fur served them well. In the forest canopy, temperatures could swing dramatically between day and night. The dense hair provided insulation against cool mornings when mist hung in the trees. During the day, it protected skin from the sun that filtered through gaps in the leaves. When it rained, and in tropical forests it rains a lot, the fur helped channel water away from the skin, keeping them relatively dry underneath. The hair also protected against the 1,000 small hazards of forest life. Thorns and rough bark, biting insects that swarmed in the humid air, scratches from branches during quick escapes from predators. Your ancestors' fur was armor, climate control, and camouflage all rolled into one. But things were changing. Slowly at first, then faster. The global climate was shifting. Africa was drying out. Those endless forests began to fragment, breaking up into patches separated by more open woodland than grassland. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It happened over millions of years, so gradually that no single generation would have noticed. But the evolutionary pressure was real and relentless. Some populations of these early hominins stayed in the shrinking forests, and their descendants would eventually become modern gorillas and chimpanzees, still hairy, still perfectly adapted to life in the trees. But other populations found themselves spending more time on the ground, in more open environments, facing entirely new challenges. This is where the story of human hair loss probably begins, somewhere between 3 and 4 million years ago, maybe earlier, maybe later. The precise timing is still debated. Because here's the frustrating thing about studying hair loss. Hair doesn't fossilize, neither does skin. We have bones from our ancestors, stone tools, sometimes even footprints preserved in volcanic ash. But we don't have their pelts hanging in some paleontological museum. Scientists have to piece together this puzzle using indirect evidence. They look at when our ancestors started spending more time on the ground based on skeletal changes that indicate upright walking. They study the environments where these ancestors lived, reconstructing ancient climates from soil samples and fossilized pollen. They compare the genetics of modern humans with our closest living relatives, looking for mutations in genes that control hair growth and trying to date when those mutations appeared. They even look at head lice. Seriously, there are two species of lice that infest humans: head lice that live in our scalp hair and body lice that live in clothing. By comparing their DNA and calculating how long ago they diverged from a common ancestor, scientists can estimate when humans lost enough body hair that lice had to evolve two separate survival strategies. The current best estimate: body lice split from head lice somewhere between 3 million and 170,000 years ago. That's a huge range, but it at least tells us that hair loss was well underway before modern humans appeared. What scientists do agree on is that this transformation happened gradually. Our ancestors didn't just wake up naked one morning. Hair loss would have occurred over hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions, each generation slightly less hairy than the last. The change would have been imperceptible to any individual, but profound across evolutionary time, and it happened during one of the most transformative periods in our evolutionary history. The same time frame when our ancestors were learning to walk upright, when brain sizes were beginning to increase, when stone tools first appeared. Hair loss wasn't happening in isolation. It was part of a complete evolutionary package that was turning tree-dwelling apes into something entirely new, something that would eventually walk out of Africa and inherit the world. But first, they had to survive the transition, and that meant adapting to a radically different way of life. The savannas were calling, and they were nothing like the forests our hairy ancestors had always known. The transition wasn't gentle. Between about 3 million and 2 million years ago, East Africa experienced some of the most dramatic climate shifts in the region's history. The planet was cooling, entering a series of ice ages that would continue in cycles for the next 2 million years. But Africa wasn't freezing. It was drying out. The mechanism was simple but devastating. As ice sheets expanded at the poles, they locked up massive amounts of water that would normally evaporate and fall as rain. Global precipitation patterns shifted. The monsoons that had kept Africa wet and forested began to fail. Year by year, decade by decade, century by century, the rains became less reliable. The forests responded the way forests always do to drought. They died. Not all at once, not everywhere, but progressively, from the drier regions inward. The tall canopy trees went first. Without regular rainfall, they couldn't maintain their massive trunks and expansive leaf systems. They died standing, their skeletal branches eventually crashing down to create clearings that let in more sunlight, which further dried the soil, which killed more trees. A feedback loop of destruction. What replaced the forests was something Africa had never seen in quite this way before. Open woodland at first, scattered trees with grass growing between them. Then, as the drying continued, true savanna. Vast grasslands dotted with occasional acacia trees, stretching to the horizon under a sun that no longer had dense canopy to filter its intensity. This was a completely new world, and it demanded completely new survival strategies. Your ancestors, those small, hairy hominins who'd been perfectly comfortable in the trees, suddenly found themselves in an environment where the old rules didn't apply. The trees they had relied on for food and safety were increasingly far apart. Moving between them meant crossing open ground, exposed ground, dangerous ground. The predators loved it. Lions, hyenas, leopards, and species of big cats that no longer exist. They had evolved for exactly this kind of terrain. Open country, where they could use their speed and their cooperative hunting tactics to bring down prey. And your ancestors, ill-equipped for ground living, slow and awkward on their feet, would have looked like easy meals. Food was a problem too. The fruits and leaves that had been abundant in the forest were scattered now, seasonal, unpredictable. The savanna offered different resources: roots and tubers buried in the hard ground, seeds from grasses, animal carcasses left by predators. But accessing these foods required new techniques, new tools, new ways of thinking about what was edible and how to process it. And then there was the heat. This might have been the worst challenge of all. In the forest, temperature regulation had been manageable. The canopy provided shade. The humidity moderated temperature swings. But on the open savanna, especially during the middle of the day, the sun was merciless. Temperatures could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground itself radiated heat. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to cool down. Picture this. You're one of these early hominins, maybe an Australopithecus afarensis, standing about 4 feet tall. You're covered in thick, dark fur because that's what your ancestors had, what the forest had required. But now you're standing in full sun on the African savanna at midday. No shade, no water nearby. You need to travel to find food, but moving generates body heat. Your fur, which used to protect you, is now trapping that heat against your skin. Your body starts to overheat, not immediately, not catastrophically, but persistently. Your core temperature creeps up. You start to pant, trying to cool down through your mouth and nasal passages, but it's not enough. You're designed for forests, not for this. Every movement makes it worse. You need to rest, but you can't rest out here in the open. The predators are watching. You need to reach the next patch of trees, maybe a mile away across exposed grassland. This happened thousands of times, millions of times, generation after generation of your ancestors facing this exact problem. Most of them dealt with it the obvious way. They stayed near water sources and wooded areas. They avoided moving during the hottest parts of the day. They changed their diets to reduce the need for long foraging trips. But some populations found themselves in situations where those conservative strategies weren't enough. Maybe their territories were particularly dry, with water sources far apart. Maybe population pressure was forcing them into marginal habitats. Maybe they were being pushed out of the better areas by more successful groups. Whatever the reason, they needed to travel farther, work harder, expose themselves to more heat stress than their fur-covered bodies could handle. And this is where natural selection started to get creative. Because in every generation, there would have been variation. Some individuals born with slightly less hair. Maybe a mutation that affected follicle density, or hair length, or the thickness of individual strands. In the old forest environment, these variations might have been neutral or even slightly disadvantageous. Less hair meant less protection, less insulation. But on the savanna they were advantages. An individual with slightly less hair could shed heat more efficiently. They could travel farther during the hot hours without their core temperature spiking dangerously. They could spend more time foraging, finding better food sources, avoiding predators by being able to move when competitors had to rest. They survived better, reproduced more successfully, passed on their less hairy genes to more offspring. The archaeological evidence supports this timing. Around 2 to 3 million years ago, we see the first stone tools appearing in the fossil record. Simple flakes and choppers, crude by later standards, but representing a cognitive leap. Tool use suggests our ancestors were processing foods in new ways, probably including scavenging meat from carcasses, activities that would have required travelling in open country. We also see skeletal changes that indicate full commitment to bipedalism. Earlier hominins had walked upright sometimes, but they still retained adaptations for climbing. But species like Homo habilis and early Homo erectus show bodies designed entirely for walking and running on 2 legs. Long legs, barrel-shaped torsos, reorganized hip and knee joints. These are bodies built for the savanna, for covering long distances efficiently in open country. and covering long distances in tropical heat creates exactly the selection pressure that would favour hair loss. Because the human body's primary cooling mechanism is sweating, and sweat works by evaporating from the skin surface, carrying heat away. But if your skin is covered in thick fur, that evaporation becomes much less efficient. The sweat gets trapped in the hair, soaks into the fur, drips off without doing its cooling job effectively. Hairless skin, by contrast, lets sweat evaporate rapidly, creating maximum cooling effect with minimum water loss. This is crucial because water was a limited resource on the Savanna. An ancestor who could cool themselves efficiently, using less water to maintain safe body temperature, could travel farther between water sources, exploit territories that hairier competitors couldn't access. The Savanna hypothesis suggests that this was the primary driver of human hair loss. Our ancestors lost their fur because they left the forests and entered an environment where being naked was actually an advantage, where the ability to keep cool mattered more than protection from the elements. It's an elegant theory, well supported by the timing of environmental changes and the fossil evidence of our ancestors' lifestyles. But like all good scientific theories, it raises as many questions as it answers. Because if heat stress and efficient cooling were the only factors, why didn't other savanna mammals lose their hair? Zebras, antelope, lions, they all face the same heat challenges and they're still covered in fur. What made the human lineage different? What other factors might have been working alongside the savanna transition to drive such dramatic change? The answer, as we'll see, involves an intricate web of physiology, behaviour, and evolutionary innovation that goes far beyond simply walking out of the forest into the sun. Here's the thing about running on the African savanna at midday. It will kill you, not might, will. Unless you have one of the most remarkable cooling systems ever evolved by any mammal on Earth. Which, as it happens, you do. Let's talk about what was really happening when your ancestors moved into open country. The savanna transition created a problem that went beyond just occasional discomfort. It created a daily, inescapable physiological crisis that had to be solved, or your lineage would die out. The crisis was this. Active hunting and foraging in tropical heat generates more body heat than a fur-covered mammal can safely dissipate. Your brain, that magnificent organ that makes you human, requires a constant temperature around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit to function properly. Go much above that and proteins start to denature. Enzymes stop working. Neurons begin to malfunction. Push past 104 degrees and you're looking at brain damage. Past 106 and you're dead. This isn't negotiable. This isn't something evolution can compromise on. Your brain must stay cool or everything stops. But here's the problem your ancestors faced. Muscles generate heat when they work. A lot of heat. Walk for an hour in the sun and your muscles might generate enough heat to raise your core temperature by 10 degrees if your body had no cooling mechanism. Run for an hour and you could generate enough heat to literally cook yourself from the inside. Every predator avoided, every mile travelled, every food source located required movement that created potentially lethal amounts of body heat. Most mammals solve this problem by being selective about when they move. Lions hunt primarily at dawn and dusk when temperatures are moderate. Antelope rest during midday, finding shade and waiting for the heat to pass. Even the most heat-adapted savanna species follow this pattern. You move when it's cooler, you rest when it's hot. Simple, effective, universal. Except your ancestors couldn't afford to follow that strategy, because they weren't apex predators who could hunt efficiently in short bursts. And they weren't fast enough to escape danger without advance warning. They needed to travel during all hours to cover enough ground to find widely scattered food sources, to reach water holes that might be miles apart. They needed to be active when other predators were resting. They needed to move when the sun was highest. This created intense selection pressure for better cooling systems. and the human body responded with what might be the most efficient temperature regulation system of any large land mammal. We sweat. Not just a little, not just when we are hot. We sweat prodigiously, systematically, with an efficiency that borders on the absurd. An average human has between 2 and 4 million sweat glands covering almost every square inch of skin. That's more sweat glands per unit of body surface area than nearly any other mammal. We can produce up to a litre of sweat per hour during heavy exertion, potentially up to 10 litres in a full day under extreme conditions. And here's the crucial part. Sweat works through evaporative cooling. Water on your skin surface absorbs heat energy and transforms from liquid to vapour. This phase change requires significant energy, about 540 calories per gram of water evaporated. That heat energy comes from your body, cooling you down in the process. It's essentially the same mechanism an air conditioner uses, except it's been refined by millions of years of evolution to be portable, self-regulating, and remarkably effective. But there's a catch. Evaporative cooling only works if the sweat can actually evaporate from your skin. If something blocks that evaporation, the whole system fails. And dense fur blocks evaporation spectacularly. Sweat produced under a thick coat of hair doesn't evaporate efficiently. It soaks into the fur, mats the hair down, eventually drips off without doing much cooling. The cooling efficiency drops by 50% or more when you compare fur-covered skin to bare skin. Maybe more under conditions of high humidity where evaporation is already limited. This is where the hairlessness advantage becomes undeniable. A naked human in the sun can maintain stable core temperature through continuous sweating far more effectively than any fur-covered mammal. The sweat forms a thin film on bare skin, evaporates rapidly in the moving air, and the skin stays relatively dry and cool even during intense exertion. The system is so efficient that humans can keep working in conditions that would force other mammals to stop and seek shade or risk fatal overheating. This connects to one of the most remarkable capabilities of the human body: persistence hunting. Now, this isn't the kind of hunting most people imagine. No quick chase, no dramatic takedown. Persistence hunting is something altogether stranger and more impressive. It's the ability to follow an animal for hours, sometimes an entire day, until the prey literally collapses from exhaustion and overheating. It works like this. You spot an antelope. You start running toward it. Not sprinting, just a steady jog. The antelope, vastly faster than you, easily runs away and disappears over a ridge. No problem. You follow its tracks. 20 minutes later, you spot it again, resting in shade. You start running toward it again. It runs away again. You follow. This continues for hours. Run, rest briefly, run again. The antelope is faster, but it can't cool down while running. It has to stop and pant to lower its body temperature, but every time it stops, you catch up. Every time it runs, it generates more heat it can't efficiently shed. Eventually, after hours of this relentless pursuit, the antelope's cooling system fails. Its core temperature spikes. It becomes uncoordinated, confused. It can no longer run effectively. You walk up to it and kill it with a simple spear or club. Not because you're stronger or faster, because you can keep cool while running and it can't. Modern hunters in the Kalahari Desert still use this technique. Researchers have documented hunts lasting 3 to 5 hours in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The hunters maintain core body temperatures barely above normal through continuous sweating. The prey animals, despite being far more adapted to the environment, overheat catastrophically because their cooling systems can't function during extended running. No other predator hunts this way, not because they lack the intelligence, but because they lack the cooling system. A lion covered in fur attempting a 5-hour chase in midday heat would die of hypothermia long before catching anything. Humans can do it comfortably, or at least survivably, because we're naked and we sweat efficiently. This hunting technique might have provided crucial protein during times when other food sources were scarce, and it would have created enormous selection pressure for any trait that improved cooling efficiency, hairlessness chief among them. But the theory has problems, significant ones. Because if overheating during persistence hunting was the primary driver of hair loss, we'd expect to see similar adaptations in other cursorial predators, animals that chase prey over long distances. Wild dogs hunt in packs for hours in African heat. They're still covered in fur. Wolves can maintain pursuit for similar durations, still furry. Cheetahs generate tremendous heat during their hunts, covered in spots and fur. There's also the question of timing. Did our ancestors really engage in persistence hunting early enough to drive the initial hair loss? Or did hairlessness evolve first for other reasons, and persistence hunting only became possible afterward? The archaeological evidence for systematic hunting doesn't appear clearly until much later, long after we'd lost most of our body hair. And finally, there's a geographical problem. Hairlessness appears to be a trait shared by all human populations, including those that moved into cold climates where efficient cooling would have been less important than insulation. If the savanna heat was the sole driver, why didn't humans who migrated to Ice Age Europe and Asia regrow their fur? The thermoregulation theory explains a lot, maybe even most of the puzzle, but it's clearly not the complete answer. Something else was happening alongside the cooling advantage. Other selection pressures working in concert with heat stress to strip away our ancestral fur and leave us uniquely naked among the primates. Now imagine this. What if your ancestors didn't lose their hair on the savanna at all? What if they lost it in the water? In 1960, a British marine biologist named Alistair Hardy proposed one of the most controversial and persistent ideas in human evolution. He suggested that somewhere between our ape-like ancestors and modern humans, there was an aquatic phase, a period when our ancestors lived semi-aquatically, spending significant portions of their time wading, swimming, and diving in shallow coastal waters or lakes. And it was this aquatic lifestyle, Hardy argued, that stripped away our fur and gave us our naked skin. The theory goes like this. Around 6 or 7 million years ago, some population of ape-like creatures found themselves living along coastlines or near large bodies of water. Maybe they were driven there by competition with other apes. Maybe climate change made their forest habitats shrink, pushing them toward water sources. Whatever the reason, they began exploiting aquatic resources, shellfish, crustaceans, fish, water plants, food sources that were abundant, nutritious, and largely unexploited by other primates. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these semi-aquatic apes adapted to their new lifestyle. They began wading into deeper water to reach better feeding grounds. They learned to dive for shellfish on the seafloor. They spent hours each day partially or fully submerged, and during this aquatic phase, natural selection stripped away their body hair, because fur is actually a disadvantage in water. It creates drag, slowing swimming. It becomes waterlogged and heavy. It takes forever to dry, creating a constant chill when you emerge from the water. Better to lose it entirely and rely on subcutaneous fat for insulation instead. The proponents of this idea, later championed more widely by writer Elaine Morgan, point to a remarkable list of features that supposedly distinguish humans from other apes and link us to aquatic mammals. Start with our hairlessness itself. Among mammals, naked skin is rare on land but common in water. Whales, dolphins, walruses, hippos, all have lost their fur or reduced it to nearly nothing. Why? Because in water, especially marine water, hair provides minimal insulation compared to blubber, and it creates problems with swimming efficiency and temperature regulation when transitioning between water and air. Then there's our subcutaneous fat layer. Humans are remarkably fatty compared to other primates. Even lean, athletic humans have more body fat than other apes. Chimpanzees typically have body fat percentages in the single digits. Humans, even fit ones, usually range from 10 to 25%. More importantly, our fat is distributed evenly across our bodies in a layer just beneath the skin, exactly like the blubber of aquatic mammals. Other primates store fat primarily around their organs when they have it at all. We store it like seals and whales. This subcutaneous fat distribution would provide excellent insulation in water while allowing freedom of movement. Consider our voluntary breath control. Most mammals can't consciously hold their breath. They can't control their breathing with the precision humans possess. But we can hold our breath for minutes if trained. We can consciously regulate our breathing patterns. We can even speak, which requires incredibly fine control over breathing muscles. This level of voluntary control is rare in land mammals, but common in diving mammals. Dolphins, seals, whales, all have sophisticated breath control for diving. The theory suggests we developed similar abilities for similar reasons. Then there's the diving reflex. Submerge a human face in cold water, and something remarkable happens. Heart rate drops. Blood vessels in the extremities constrict. Blood flow is redirected to vital organs. This is called the mammalian diving reflex, and humans have a particularly strong version of it. Stronger than other primates, closer to the response seen in seals and other diving mammals. The reflex is especially pronounced in human infants, who can survive surprisingly long underwater immersions because their bodies automatically shift into a water conservation mode. Human babies also demonstrate something aquatic ape proponents find significant. They can swim, or at least make coordinated swimming movements from birth. Place a newborn in water, and they'll hold their breath automatically and make paddling motions. They seem comfortable in water in a way that infant chimps definitely are not. Is this evidence of an aquatic ancestry? The theory points to our bipedalism too. Wading in shallow water is one of the few circumstances where walking upright becomes easier than quadrupedal movement. Wade into waist-deep water on 4 limbs, and you're struggling to keep your head above the surface. Stand upright and you can wade comfortably into much deeper water. Maybe, the theory suggests, we became bipedal not on the savanna but in the shallows, walking upright to reach deeper feeding areas while keeping our heads above water. Even our nakedness distribution seems to support this. We've lost hair almost everywhere, but we retain it on our heads. Why? The aquatic ape theory suggests head hair provided protection from the sun for the part of the body that would remain above water during wading and swimming. Meanwhile, we lost hair on the parts that would be submerged most of the time. It's a compelling narrative. It explains multiple human peculiarities with a single scenario, and it has a romantic appeal. Who wouldn't want to imagine our ancestors as skilled swimmers and divers, harvesting the ocean's bounty in some lost coastal paradise? But mainstream paleoanthropology has largely rejected the aquatic ape hypothesis. Not because scientists are closed-minded or resistant to new ideas, but because the evidence doesn't hold up under scrutiny, and the theory fails to account for what we actually know about human evolution. Start with the fossil evidence, or rather, the complete absence of fossil evidence supporting an aquatic phase. We have a decent fossil record of human evolution from about 6 million years ago to the present. These fossils come from a variety of environments, many from lakesides and riversides, true, but that's just because fossils preserve better in sediments near water. The actual anatomical features of these fossils show adaptations for terrestrial life. There's no evidence of specialized aquatic adaptations in the skeleton. No flattened limbs, no webbing between fingers or toes, none of the skeletal modifications that appear in genuinely aquatic mammals. The subcutaneous fat argument sounds good until you examine other terrestrial mammals. Bears have substantial fat layers. So do many cold-adapted land mammals. Fat distribution in humans is actually quite different from marine mammals. Seals and whales have blubber that's much thicker and more evenly distributed than human fat. Our fat deposits still show clear patterns of sexual dimorphism and regional variation that make much more sense in a terrestrial context. The diving reflex exists in all mammals to some degree. It's not unique to humans or aquatic species. Yes, human babies can make swimming motions, but so can kittens and puppies when you put them in water. It's a generalized mammalian response, not evidence of aquatic specialization. And those swimming movements in human infants don't actually propel them effectively. They're reflexive movements, not functional swimming. Bipedalism is far better explained by terrestrial adaptations. The fossil evidence shows gradual evolution of upright walking in savanna and woodland environments, not coastal settings. The skeletal changes required for efficient bipedalism, changes in the pelvis, leg bones and foot structure, make perfect sense for terrestrial walking and running, but would be unnecessary for wading. And here's the fundamental problem with the aquatic ape theory. It tries to explain adaptations that aren't actually unusual in the way it claims. Hairlessness isn't common in aquatic mammals. Most seals have fur. River otters have dense coats. Beavers are furry. The truly hairless aquatic mammals like whales and dolphins lost their hair as part of extreme specialization for full-time aquatic life, not as semi-aquatic waders. There's no evidence humans ever went through anything like that level of aquatic adaptation. The theory also fails to explain why humans who moved inland and into cold climates didn't regrow their fur. If aquatic life selected for hairlessness, leaving the water should have selected for regaining it. But archaeological evidence shows hairless humans spreading into environments where aquatic resources were minimal or absent, and they stayed hairless. What the aquatic ape theory gets right is this. Human ancestors almost certainly did exploit aquatic resources. Shellfish middens show up in archaeological sites. Coastal and lakeside environments probably were important habitats. But occasional wading for shellfish is very different from the extended aquatic phase the theory requires. You don't need millions of years of aquatic specialization to wade into shallow water and collect clams. The theory remains popular because it's a good story. It's simple, dramatic, and it makes humans feel special in a different way than the usual narratives. But good stories aren't always true stories, and in science, evidence matters more than narrative appeal. The evidence for a terrestrial explanation of human hairlessness, whatever that explanation might be, is vastly stronger than the evidence for an aquatic phase that left no trace in the fossil record and required adaptations that never fully developed. Human evolution happened on land, in Africa, among populations adapting to changing climates and new ecological opportunities. The water might have been important, but we never became aquatic apes. We remained terrestrial primates who occasionally got our feet wet while doing something else entirely, something that would prove far more important to our survival than any amount of swimming ever could. What if the real enemy wasn't heat or predators, or even finding food? What if it was something much smaller, something that lived in the very fur that was supposed to protect us? Picture your hairy ancestors, living in small groups somewhere in Africa between 3 and 2 million years ago. They're not alone. In every strand of hair, crawling through every follicle, breeding in every warm crevice of their bodies, are passengers. Ticks swollen with blood, burrowing into skin around the ears and groin. Lice, thousands of them, moving through scalp hair and body hair, laying eggs that hatch into more lice. Fleas jumping from individual to individual during social grooming or sleep. Mites tunneling through skin, creating itching sores that never quite heal. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Because these parasites weren't just annoying hitchhikers. They were vectors, carriers of some of the most devastating diseases in mammalian history. Ticks transmitted bacterial infections that could cause fever, organ failure, and death. Lice carried epidemic typhus, a disease that has killed millions of humans throughout recorded history and probably killed countless more before we learned to write about it. Fleas spread plague, the same disease that would later kill a third of medieval Europe's population. Every mammal deals with ectoparasites, parasites that live on the outside of the body. But for highly social primates living in close contact, sharing sleeping sites and grooming each other constantly, the parasite burden would have been especially severe. Modern chimpanzees spend hours each day grooming, picking through each other's fur, removing parasites. It's social bonding, yes, but it's also desperate pest control. And even with all that effort, they still carry substantial parasite loads. Now add one more factor. Your ancestors were changing their behavior in ways that made the parasite problem worse. They were sleeping in caves and rock shelters, returning to the same sites night after night. They were probably starting to use animal skins for warmth and carrying. They were spending more time on the ground where tick populations were highest. They were living in larger groups than their forest-dwelling ancestors. Every one of these behavioral changes created new opportunities for parasites to spread. In the 1980s and 90s, several researchers proposed what became known as the ectoparasite hypothesis. The idea is elegant and brutal. Humans lost their body hair because hairless individuals had fewer places for parasites to hide, lower parasite loads, and therefore better survival and reproductive success. Over hundreds of thousands of years, natural selection favored increasingly hairless individuals, not because naked skin helped them run or swim, but because it helped them avoid being eaten alive by tiny disease-carrying arthropods. The hypothesis explained some puzzling features of human hair distribution. We lost hair on most of our bodies, but kept it in specific locations. Where did we keep it? On our heads, in our armpits, and around our genitals. Why those places? The head hair makes sense if you still need sun protection for your brain, but the armpit and pubic hair seem counterintuitive if the whole point was avoiding parasites. Unless those patches of hair served a different function, scent dispersion, sexual signaling, something important enough that the parasite cost was worth paying in just those limited areas. There's supporting evidence from the evolutionary history of lice. Genetic analysis of human lice tells a fascinating story. Body lice, the kind that live in clothing rather than hair, diverged from head lice somewhere between 70,000 and 170,000 years ago. This suggests humans became hairless enough that body lice had to adapt to living in clothing rather than body hair. The timing is roughly consistent with estimates for when humans might have lost most of their body hair and begun wearing clothing regularly. Even more intriguingly, there are actually 3 distinct types of human lice: head lice, body lice, and pubic lice. The pubic lice are actually more closely related to gorilla lice than to human head lice, suggesting they jumped species at some point, probably after humans had already lost most of their body hair but retained pubic hair. It's a weird detail, but it suggests our hair loss was already well advanced by the time we acquired our current pubic lice population. The hypothesis also fits with what we know about parasite loads in other mammals. Species that live in dense populations or return regularly to the same burrows and dens tend to have higher parasite burdens than solitary nomadic species. If early humans were increasingly sedentary, using the same caves and rock shelters repeatedly, their parasite problems would have been getting worse, just as they were developing the behavioral complexity that made reducing those problems especially important. Because here's the thing about parasites. They don't just make you uncomfortable, they consume resources your body needs for other things. Energy that could go toward brain development, muscle building, reproduction, or fighting off other diseases gets diverted to fighting parasite infections. In a marginal environment where every calorie counts, a heavy parasite load could mean the difference between surviving and starving, between having healthy children and watching them die from infections. Hairlessness would have provided a real advantage. Parasites would have nowhere to hide during grooming. Visual inspection of naked skin is far more effective than trying to pick through dense fur. Individuals could check themselves and each other for ticks and other parasites much more easily. This would have been especially important for ticks, which need to attach for hours or days to transmit many diseases. Early detection and removal could prevent infection. But the ectoparasite hypothesis faces significant challenges. The most obvious is that it doesn't explain why other social, ground-dwelling primates didn't also lose their hair. Baboons live in large troops, sleep in the same sites repeatedly, and groom each other extensively. They deal with the same parasites that would have plagued early humans, yet they remain fully furred. Why would the same selective pressure produce different results? The timing is also uncertain. Most estimates suggest humans lost their body hair somewhere between 1 and 3 million years ago, but we have no direct fossil evidence of when this happened. We're inferring it from genetic studies of skin pigmentation and lice evolution, which provide only approximate dates. If hair loss happened before humans developed the behavioral patterns that would have made parasite loads especially problematic, like regular use of sleeping sites and larger group sizes, the hypothesis loses explanatory power. There's also the question of trade-offs. Hair provides significant benefits. It protects skin from abrasion, insect bites, and sun damage. It provides some insulation in cold weather. Losing it entirely would have created new problems even as it solved the parasite problem. Unless humans were simultaneously developing other solutions like clothing and controlled fire use, the costs of hairlessness might have outweighed the benefits. Some researchers have suggested a modified version of the hypothesis. Maybe hairlessness wasn't primarily selected for parasite avoidance, but once it began for other reasons, reduced parasite loads provided additional selective advantage that accelerated the process. In this view, parasites weren't the main driver, but rather one factor among several, all pushing in the same direction. The truth is probably complex. Parasites were certainly a problem for our ancestors. Reducing that problem would certainly have provided survival advantages, but whether parasite avoidance was powerful enough, acting alone, to drive the complete loss of body hair across an entire species remains uncertain. What we can say is that once our ancestors began losing their hair, for whatever reason, being able to see and remove parasites more easily would have been a welcome side benefit. Whether it was the cause or just a consequence, freedom from the worst of the parasite burden would have made our naked ancestors' difficult lives at least slightly more bearable. So parasites may have pushed us towards smoother skin, but parasites alone don't explain why our species went so far, or why we kept hair in some places that seem oddly strategic. To understand that part of the story, we have to bring in another of Darwin's big ideas. Not natural selection, but its flashier cousin, sexual selection. Darwin noticed something strange when he looked at animals like peacocks, birds of paradise, and deer. Many traits didn't just help individuals survive, they helped them get chosen. Huge antlers that make it harder to run through forests. Bright plumage that practically screams "eat me" to predators. Songs and dances that burn energy with no obvious survival payoff. If natural selection is about not dying, sexual selection is about not dying alone. Traits that make you more attractive to mates, or help you outcompete rivals, can spread through a population even if they come with survival costs. Because if you don't reproduce, your perfect survival record is irrelevant. From evolution's point of view, your genes are a dead end. So imagine your ancestors, already partly hair-reduced for reasons like heat, parasites, or something else entirely. Not bald, not yet, but with thinner, patchier body hair than a chimp or gorilla. Enough skin showing that it becomes visible in a new way. And now something subtle shifts. In that world, every advantage matters. Surviving is hard. Childhood is dangerous. Disease is common. Anything that signals, I'm healthy, I'm fertile, my body is functioning well becomes valuable. Your ancestors might not have had words for it, but their instincts were watching, evaluating, choosing. What's one of the clearest, most honest signals of internal health? Skin. Bare skin shows everything. Dehydration, malnutrition, infection, hormonal changes, pregnancy, age. A thick coat of fur hides the fine-grained details of health status. Naked skin broadcasts it in high definition. A mate with smooth, unblemished skin is less likely to be riddled with disease. Fewer sores, fewer rashes, fewer chronic infections. A mate whose wounds heal cleanly and quickly has a robust immune system. A mate whose skin glows with good circulation and nutrition is more likely to carry a pregnancy successfully or provide strong offspring. Over generations, individuals who found these cues attractive would choose partners whose skin honestly advertised health. Their children would inherit both healthier bodies and a preference for those visible signals. That creates a feedback loop, a coevolution between what bodies look like and what minds find beautiful. In that loop, every step towards smoother, barer skin increases the amount of information visible, and therefore increases the advantage of preferring partners whose skin looks good. Hair becomes a veil. Skin becomes a billboard. Sexual selection can be surprisingly powerful. It doesn't need to make conscious sense. No one has to stand up and declare, "From now on I prefer less hairy mates." All it takes is small differences in preference, repeated over thousands of generations. A slight bias toward partners whose skin is more visible, whose scars and infections are easier to evaluate, whose youth and vitality are written directly on their bodies. Over a long enough time span, those small biases can sculpt a species. This might also help explain something else, the strange pattern of where we kept hair and how it differs between the sexes. Across most human populations, adult men tend to grow thicker facial and body hair than women. Women tend to have less trunk and limb hair, finer facial hair, and smoother overall skin appearance. In many cultures, even where body hair is common, less hairy has been coded as more youthful, more feminine, more desirable, at least for women. Sexual selection theory would read this as a hint. If hairlessness advertised youth and health, it might have been especially important in evaluating female fertility. In mammals, female reproductive value is closely tied to age. Younger adult females are generally more fertile, less likely to have accumulated chronic disease, and more likely to survive the dangers of pregnancy and child-rearing. In a partly hairless species, visible skin becomes a direct age signal. Children are smooth, elders accumulate wrinkles, sun damage, and scars. Selecting mates whose skin still carries the markers of youth means, on average, better odds of healthy offspring. If males tended to compete more for mates, traits that help them win contests or signal strength, like greater overall size, muscle mass, and later in evolution, facial hair as a marker of maturity, could be favored. Meanwhile, if males also preferred females whose bodies more clearly advertised youth and health, female bodies might have been pushed toward even smoother skin, reduced visible body hair, and a stronger link between apparent and actual age. That doesn't mean our ancestors thought about any of this consciously. Attraction isn't a committee decision. It's an instinctive calculator tuned over millions of years by what worked. Bare skin also opened up new possibilities for social signaling beyond health and age. Blushing, for instance, is far more visible in a hairless, lightly pigmented face. Emotional states, fear, anger, embarrassment, become easier to read on exposed skin. In a deeply social species, being able to see another person's state of mind on their face and body might have made cooperation and trust easier. Sexual selection, in this view, isn't just about who looks prettiest. It's about who can reliably communicate, who can be read and understood. And then there's the simple possibility of novelty. Imagine growing up in a group where most people are moderately hairy, but a few individuals are strikingly less so. Their skin catches the light in a different way. Their bodies look unusual, distinctive. Sexual selection can latch onto almost any distinctive trait if it becomes associated with successful, desirable partners. Over time, the trait spreads. What began as an oddity becomes the norm. But like every theory, the sexual selection explanation has problems. For one thing, it's hard to test. Fossils don't preserve skin or hair patterns. We can't directly see what our ancestors looked like or ask them what they preferred. We're inferring from genetics, from comparisons with other primates, from modern human variation, and from general principles of evolutionary biology. Another issue. Sexual selection can explain how extreme traits spread once preferences exist. It's less clear about why those preferences arose in the first place. Why would early hominins start preferring slightly less hair? Was it because of health signaling? Because of emotional readability? Because less hair happened to correlate with some other survival advantage like parasite reduction or heat tolerance? The theory can't easily disentangle cause and effect. And if hairlessness was sexually attractive, why didn't other social primates follow the same path? Male mandrills, for instance, have brightly coloured faces and rumps that are clearly shaped by sexual selection, but they're still covered in fur. Chimpanzees groom each other constantly. They could, in theory, use visible skin to judge health too, yet they kept their coats. Critics also point out that what humans find attractive today is heavily shaped by culture. Some societies prize body hair in men, others reject it. Some remove hair cosmetically, others don't. Using modern beauty standards to reconstruct ancient evolutionary pressures is risky at best. There's also the bigger picture. Sexual selection rarely acts alone. A peacock's tail isn't just pretty, it's also a test of his ability to survive despite its handicap. The most plausible scenario for human hair loss is probably similar. A mix of forces: thermoregulation, parasite reduction, environmental change, social signaling, all nudging in roughly the same direction. Once a basic trend toward reduced body hair existed for any reason, sexual selection could have magnified and refined it, turning modest thinning into the dramatic hairlessness we see today. So, was bare skin our prehistoric beauty standard? Maybe. Or maybe it was first a survival adaptation that later became bound up with ideas of attractiveness, youth, and health. Either way, once our ancestors crossed the threshold into visible skin, there was no going back. Too much information, too much social and sexual meaning was written there. And that brings us to another turning point, because a naked body in a dangerous world is a problem that demands a solution. Losing hair only works if you find something else to stand between your skin and the elements, something you can put on and take off. At first, that something else probably wasn't very impressive. Not tailored outfits, not stitched seams, more like improvised barriers, a fresh hide thrown over the shoulders on a windy night, a bundle of dry grass used as a makeshift blanket, a handful of smouldering embers carried from a burned tree to a sheltered overhang, coaxed back to life after dark. But lurking behind all those small improvisations was one truly radical idea. Maybe your own body didn't have to do all the work anymore. For millions of years, mammals had solved the problem of temperature the same way. Grow your own insulation. Fur, blubber, dense undercoats. Evolution sculpted bodies to match the climate, and if the climate shifted too fast, species died. Simple. Brutal. Control of fire broke that rule. We don't know exactly when your ancestors first tamed flame. There are scattered hints going back incredibly far. Charred bones and heated stone at sites over 1 million years old. burned plant remains in places where lightning strikes seem unlikely, layers of ash that look more like hearths than wildfires. Some researchers argue that early members of our genus, Homo erectus, around 1.5 million years ago, were already using fire regularly. Others are more cautious, placing reliable, habitual fire use closer to 800,000 or 500,000 years ago. The evidence is patchy, the interpretation debated, but by the time our lineage was well on its way toward modern humans, fire was definitely part of the toolkit. And once that happened, everything changed. Think about what a controlled fire meant on a cold night. Before fire, your only defenses against dropping temperature were built into your biology: fur density, fat reserves, curling up with others for shared warmth. If the night was colder than your adaptations could handle, there wasn't much you could do but shiver and hope. After fire, you could step outside that prison. You could create a pocket of summer in the middle of winter, a tiny artificial sun radiating heat into the darkness. Sit close enough, and the flames did what fur once did. They created a warm boundary layer around your skin, a cushion of air hotter than the surrounding world. They dried your sweat, reduced the need for a constant insulating coat, and allowed your body to rely less on internal thermoregulation and more on an external controllable source. In evolutionary terms, that's huge, because once technology starts doing the job of biology, natural selection can relax its grip on certain traits. If fire makes freezing nights survivable, the penalty for having slightly less protective hair is reduced. Individuals who might once have died in a cold snap can now make it through, as long as they know how to find kindling and keep embers alive. Over many generations, that softens the cost of hair loss. It doesn't mean fire caused hairlessness by itself. Body hair was already being thinned by other pressures: heat, parasites, maybe sexual and social selection. But fire made those changes less dangerous. It cushioned the risk. It let evolution experiment more boldly with a barer body. There's another clue hiding in the timeline. Genetic studies of our own species suggest that the loss of thick body hair happened fairly early in the human story. When scientists compare the mutation rates in genes associated with hair growth to those in our closest relatives, they estimate that our ancestors began shifting toward a much more naked skin somewhere between about 1.2 million and 700,000 years ago. Those dates line up suspiciously well with the evidence for increasingly regular fire use. Correlation isn't causation, but in deep time, when we can't watch events unfold directly, correlations matter. They tell us when different pieces of the puzzle were even on the table together. By the time your ancestors were walking through African evenings with mostly bare skin, sparks were already flying from the campfires into the night. Still, fire alone wasn't enough. A campfire warms your front but not your back. It's wonderful when you're near it, but useless when you have to range out to hunt, gather, or explore. You can't carry a blazing hearth over your shoulders like a cloak. Clothing solved that problem. The first clothing probably didn't look like clothes to us at all. No tailored sleeves, no fitted hoods, more like draped hides, loosely tied skirts of plant fibre, wrapped furs held in place with simple belts or bone pins. But functionally, it did something astonishing. It turned warmth into an object. Instead of being locked inside muscle and fur, insulation became portable, shareable, repairable. You could take it off when it was hot, put it on when it was cold, lend it to a shivering child, fold it and carry it from one camp to another. You could live in places where a naked ape technically had no business surviving, because your fur was no longer part of your body. It hung in your hands. For a long time, archaeologists had almost no direct evidence for when this began, because early clothing rots. Leather bark, woven plant fibres, they vanish quickly in most environments. But evolution left a different kind of record. Not in bones, not in stone, but in parasites. Body lice are a special kind of hitchhiker. Unlike head lice, which cling to scalp hair, body lice live mainly in clothing. They lay their eggs in the seams. They travel with fabric, not fur. They're only able to exist as a species when their hosts are regularly wearing something against their skin. So if you can figure out when body lice split off genetically from head lice, you get a rough date for when humans started wearing clothing often enough to support a new parasite niche. Genetic studies of lice have done exactly that. When scientists looked at the DNA of modern lice species, they found that body lice diverged from head lice somewhere around 170,000 years ago. Some estimates stretch back to 200,000 or even 300,000 years, but most cluster in that late Pleistocene window. That suggests that by that time, long before agriculture, long before writing, our ancestors were already routinely wrapping themselves in artificial fur, not just occasionally grabbing a hide when it snowed. Routinely enough that an entire new parasite could evolve to exploit this portable microclimate. Notice what this means. By 170,000 years ago, humans had likely been mostly hairless for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd been living with exposed skin, shaped by heat and disease and social life. Now, on top of that, they were layering an invented pelt back onto their bodies, a pelt that could be removed, altered, shared, decorated. Technology had come full circle. First we lost fur, then we learned to make our own, and that feedback loop kept going. Once clothing exists, it doesn't just protect you from cold, it changes what naked even means. It shifts modesty, status, identity. It lets people specialize, some tanning hides, some weaving fibers, some trading finished garments across long distances. Your relationship with your own body becomes less fixed, less purely biological. You can choose how much to cover and when and with what. Fire and clothing together created a new kind of creature. Biologically, we were fragile, thin skin, little natural insulation, easily damaged by cold and sun. Culturally, we were armoured, wrapped in hides, huddled around fires, carrying embers between camps. Your ancestors stepped into night landscapes that would kill a naked primate in hours. This technological revolution didn't just keep us warm, it shifted the balance of power between genes and culture. Before fire and clothing, an animal survived or failed based largely on inherited traits. Afterward, learned skills and shared tools mattered just as much. A child born slightly more vulnerable to cold could still thrive if their group knew how to stitch a tighter parka or build a better windbreak. In that world, the strict link between climate and body began to loosen. Evolution could afford to sculpt us for other priorities, brains, social complexity, fine motor skills, because our inventions were picking up the slack on basic survival tasks like staying warm. We had stepped onto a new evolutionary path, one where culture and technology didn't just reflect our biology, but actively redirected it. Our naked skin was no longer a final verdict, it was a starting point, a blank canvas that firelight and fabric could transform, and under that canvas, at the deepest level, another story was unfolding. In our chromosomes, our follicles, our pigments. A story written in genes that were being reshaped by this strange new life lived between flame and fur. The strange thing is, underneath all this talk of fire and clothing and climate, your body never actually got rid of its fur-making machinery. It just changed how that machinery is used. Right now, on your own skin, there are roughly as many hair follicles as you'd find on a chimpanzee, not similar. Not in the same ballpark, essentially the same order of density. Run your fingers over your forearm, it feels bare, smooth, nothing like the thick pelt of a chimp. But if you look closely under good light, or tilt your arm just right, you'll see it, a faint blur of tiny hairs, almost translucent, lying flat against the skin. That's the hidden forest. Biologists call most of those strands vellus hairs. Vellus hair is the quiet background of your body. It's soft, short, usually unpigmented. It doesn't stand up to trap air, doesn't bulk out into an insulating coat. It's like a schematic drawing of fur rather than the real thing, a blueprint instead of a building. Then there's the other kind, terminal hair. Terminal hairs are the ones we notice. Thick, pigmented, long-growing. The tufts on your scalp. The brows that keep sweat out of your eyes. The bristles on your chin or in your armpits, depending on your sex and hormones. These are the descendants of an ancestral pelt turned into strategic outposts. The naked ape look, genetically speaking, isn't about losing follicles. It's about changing which follicles grow what type of hair, at what time, under which instructions. That change lives in your DNA. Hair is built through a complicated conversation between dozens, maybe hundreds of genes. Some of them control the development of follicles in the embryo. Others switch on and off during different phases of the hair cycle: growth, rest, shedding. Still others dictate thickness, curl, color, and response to hormones. Over the last couple of decades, as gene sequencing has gotten faster and cheaper, researchers have begun comparing these hair-related genes in humans to those in chimps, other primates, and even unrelated mammals. What they're finding is a kind of molecular crime scene. Not a single clean cut, but lots of little changes that together add up to less fur. Several genes stand out. One is called HR, short for hairless. In humans, rare mutations in HR cause nearly complete hair loss. Scalp, eyebrows, body hair, everything. In mice, breaking this gene produces a similar effect. That tells us HR is a major regulator of follicle cycling and maintenance. Subtle differences in how it's expressed might help explain why our follicles tend to produce short, wispy vellus hairs instead of thick fur over most of the body. Another key player is EDAR, a gene involved in the development of hair, teeth, and sweat glands. A particular variant of EDAR, common in East Asian and some Native American populations, is associated with thicker, straighter scalp hair and changes in sweat gland density. Comparing EDAR and its relatives in humans and chimps suggests our lineage tuned this pathway differently, prioritizing sweat production and selective terminal hair over a uniform coat. FOXI3, LHX2, FGF5, KRT, keratin genes, and a whole cluster of signaling molecules like CHEWNT and the SHH pathways also show differences between humans and our hairier cousins. Each tweak is small on its own, but together they reshape the developmental landscape. Then there are genes that don't build hair directly but influence its environment. Genes that ramp up eccrine sweat gland density, for example. Humans are sweat champions. We have far more of these glands, and they're much more active than in chimps. Some researchers think that as our sweating system intensified, selection favoured skin where glands weren't buried under a thick insulating mat of terminal hair. Comparative genomics backs this up. When scientists line up human DNA with chimp DNA and look for regions that have changed unusually fast in our lineage, so-called human-accelerated regions, quite a few sit near genes involved in skin, follicles, and glands. It looks as if evolution was tinkering with the entire skin-hair-sweat complex as a unit, not just trimming fur in isolation. One recent line of research zeroed in on a set of regulatory DNA sequences near hair growth genes. These aren't genes themselves, but switches, short bits of code that tell nearby genes when and where to turn on. In humans, several of these switches are either broken, weakened, or repurposed. The result is lower activity of certain hair growth genes on the trunk and limbs, while activity stays high or even increases on the scalp and in other specialized regions. Another study compared people with naturally sparse body hair to those with denser coverage and found differences in the expression of genes controlling the transition from vellus to terminal hair. It's as though our species as a whole sits at one extreme of a spectrum that still exists within us. Turn the dial a bit, and arms, legs and torsos become furrier or barer without changing the number of follicles at all. Even conditions like hypertrichosis, the rare werewolf syndrome, where people grow unusually dense hair over much of the body, reveal how close the old machinery still is to the surface. Often, these conditions are caused by small disruptions in regulatory regions, not by inventing new genes from scratch. The potential for a thicker coat is still encoded, it's just usually suppressed. So if the genes for hair are still there, just modulated, why didn't evolution push them further and give us truly naked skin, smooth as a dolphin from head to toe? Part of the answer is that completely hairless isn't actually a clear advantage on land. Hair, even in small amounts, still does useful work. It helps with sensation. Follicles are surrounded by nerve endings that pick up the tiniest movements of air or touch. A faint brush of vellus hair on your arm can tell you about an insect landing or a shift in breeze long before your skin feels it directly. Hair also plays a role in microbial and mechanical protection. Those thin hairs disrupt airflow just enough to reduce how quickly moisture evaporates, which matters in hot, dry environments. They can trap a thin layer of boundary air, offering minimal but non-zero insulation when conditions flip from blazing day to chilly night. More importantly, hair distribution became specialized instead of uniform. The scalp stayed hairy because head hair solves several problems at once. It shields the brain case from solar radiation, slows heat gain in direct sun, and, when wet with sweat, becomes part of an evaporative cooling system. Dense, dark hair over a relatively small surface area balances protection and heat loss, in a way that a bald scalp in the African sun simply wouldn't. Other patches, eyebrows, eyelashes, pubic and armpit hair, shifted towards social, sexual and protective roles. They wick sweat, trap scent molecules, protect delicate tissues, and provide visual cues. That's a story we'll explore more when we talk about why we kept hair in certain places. Full-body hairlessness would have thrown away all those benefits. On a bare, uninsulated, fully exposed skin, even minor abrasions and UV damage would be more severe. Thin vellus coverage and strategic terminal patches seem to have hit a sweet spot. Enough exposure for efficient sweating and parasite detection, enough coverage for sensation, signaling, and local protection. And once culture stepped in with fire, clothing, and shelter, the selection pressure for any additional biological hair loss probably weakened. There wasn't much extra survival gain to be had by going from sparse to zero, especially if that made you more vulnerable to sunburn, scratches, or sensory loss. So our genome settled into a compromise. Keep the follicles, keep the capacity, tune the switches so that most of the time they express as fine vellus hair on the body, robust terminal hair on the head, and specialized patches elsewhere. Let sweat glands and brain size and social behavior take center stage, while the old fur recedes into a kind of ghost. Under a microscope, your skin still remembers the past. Every follicle is a tiny time capsule, a relic of the forest-dwelling primate who once wore a full coat. But evolution didn't erase that past. It rewrote it. It turned a uniform pelt into a pattern, a code of bare and covered, thick and thin, that would later shape everything from how we caught each other to how we survive sunlight. And that pattern isn't random. On your scalp, under your arms, at the brows and lashes, and in a few other intimate places, hair refused to disappear. In those surviving islands of fur, you can still see the contour of the trade-offs that made us who we are. The balance between heat and cold, protection and exposure, biology and culture. To understand why those patches remained, and what they still do for us today, we have to zoom in even closer, to the strange geography of hair that marks the modern human body. Start at the top. If our ancestors were busy turning a full body coat into a sparse strategic pattern, the scalp is the place where the old rulebook held on the tightest. Head hair didn't just survive. In humans, it became extravagant. No other primate grows scalp hair that can keep lengthening for years, falling past the shoulders, the waist, even the knees if you let it. Chimpanzee head hair is short, self-limiting. Ours is more like a renewable fabric. Why? First, physics. Your brain is a furnace. Even at rest, it burns a huge chunk of your body's energy. In an open savanna under a high African sun, that meant your ancestors were walking around with a delicate, heat-sensitive organ, sitting a few centimeters beneath a dark, sun-facing surface. Scalp hair acts like a built-in parasol. A dense mat of hair intercepts ultraviolet radiation before it hits the skin, reducing DNA damage and the risk of cancers and heat stroke. At the same time, it creates a thin layer of air between hair and scalp. That air layer slows radiant heating but still lets sweat evaporate. In hot, dry environments, this combination, shade plus ventilation, is about as good as it gets. Experiments with thermal cameras and heat sensors back this up. People with dark, tightly curled hair, like many populations adapted to equatorial sun, show less direct scalp heating than those with straight or very short hair under the same sunlight. The hair trap's air breaks up the light, throws shade on the skin. There's also impact protection. Your ancestors fell, fought, carried loads on their heads, slept on hard ground. A padded scalp is a small but real buffer against cuts and abrasions. In a world without antiseptic, every cut is a gamble. Fewer scalp wounds meant fewer infections close to the brain case. Once that basic protective role was in place, other forces could start to play with the canvas. Hair colour, thickness, curl pattern, the age when hair thins or greys. These vary wildly across human populations. Some of that variation likely reflects adaptation to different climates. Tightly coiled hair dispersing heat near the equator, straighter hair perhaps better under hats and cold weather coverings, lighter hair in high latitudes where UV is weaker and vitamin D scarcity is a problem. But scalp hair is also one of the most visible, modifiable traits on the human body. You can cut it, braid it, dye it with plant pigments or mineral clays. Long before scissors and salons, it would have been a natural billboard for identity and status, age, group membership, health. Selection doesn't need a conscious plan. If certain hair patterns tended to be associated with partners who were well-fed, well-integrated in their groups, or better protected from the sun, those patterns would drift upward over generations. Slowly, the line between purely functional and quietly attractive blurs. Move a little lower to a pair of small but strangely expressive strips of hair. The eyebrows. Eyebrows are easy to take for granted. Lose them, and the world feels different. They are first a mechanical solution. Sweat running down from a hot, damp scalp wants to follow gravity. The convex shape of the brow ridge and the brush of eyebrow hairs divert that salty stream sideways, away from the eyes. In rain, dust, or dripping groundwater in a cave, they do much the same. Eyelashes extend that protective ring. Each lash is a tripwire. As air moves across the eye, lashes help regulate the microcurrents, reducing drying. When a speck of grit or an insect approaches, the lashes feel the disturbance, and reflexes slam the eyelid shut before the eye itself is touched. It's an alarm system built from keratin. But eyebrows also became something else. Punctuation marks on the face. Human faces are unusually flat compared to other primates. We lack the heavy muzzles and protruding jaws that can signal mood in a chimp or baboon. Instead, a lot of our emotional signaling moved upward into the muscles of the forehead and around the eyes. Eyebrows turn those subtle muscular shifts into high-contrast patterns. Raised brows, knitted brows, one side cocked higher than the other. These are tiny adjustments, but over tens of thousands of years they became a visual language, in a noisy world, at a distance, in low light around a campfire. Being able to read someone's intentions in the flick of a brow might have meant the difference between cooperation and conflict. Selection doesn't just shape bodies against climate and predators, it shapes them to be readable to each other. From eyebrows and lashes, drop to places most of us spend a lot of effort hiding, trimming or altering, the armpits and the pubic region. When humans thinned their fur over the torso and limbs, these patches didn't simply stay as they were, they transformed. The hair in your armpits and pubic area is terminal hair, coarser, curlier, more strongly pigmented than most vellus hair. It appears in puberty, under the influence of androgens. That timing is a clue. This isn't just leftover insulation, it's linked to sexual maturity. You also have a special type of sweat gland concentrated in these areas, apocrine glands. Unlike the watery, salty sweat from the eccrine glands that cover most of your skin, apocrine secretions are richer in lipids and other organic molecules. On their own, they're nearly odorless, but skin bacteria feast on them and, while doing so, transform them into a cloud of volatile compounds. Hair in these regions acts like a diffuser. Curled strands increase surface area, wick secretions away from the skin, and trap the resulting scent molecules, releasing them slowly rather than letting them evaporate all at once. To a nose tuned by evolution, our nose tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, rather than the fragranced version we live with now, that cloud would have carried information, sex, age, hormonal state, perhaps even stress levels and immune system clues. Other mammals do something very similar with scent glands and fur tufts. They mark territory, advertise fertility, recognize kin. In humans, the story's more subtle and complicated, because our sense of smell and our cultural habits have both changed, but the anatomy hints at a past where body odor wasn't just a nuisance, it was a signal. Pubic hair also provides mechanical protection. Where skin rubs against skin, or against rough plant fibers used as early clothing, coarse hair reduces friction and abrasion. Armpit hair performs a similar function, acting as a sliding layer where the arm meets the torso, especially when lifting, carrying and climbing. So those awkward, often shaved patches are really multi-tool zones: mechanical buffer, scent disperser, maturation flag. Framing the lower half of the face, another patch of selective hair became especially variable. Facial hair in males. The human beard is one of evolution's more theatrical flourishes. Like scalp hair, beard hair grows long, thick and pigmented. Unlike scalp hair, it explodes into full expression precisely when testosterone rises in adolescence. Across cultures and ages, beards have carried a heavy load of symbolism: age, dominance, masculinity, wisdom, wildness, piety. Strip away the cultural specifics, and a few biological themes stand out. One idea is that beards act as status signals. A thick beard visually enlarges the jawline and lower face, making the head look bigger and the features more imposing. In confrontational situations that could exaggerate perceived threat, much like fur fluffing in other mammals. Some studies suggest beards also slightly soften the impact of glancing blows to the jaw by adding a bit of padding and by dispersing force. Not much, but in a close contest, any margin helps. Another possibility is that beards evolved less for male-male competition and more for female choice. If beard growth depends on a healthy endocrine system and adequate nutrition, then beard fullness might have served as a rough, unreliable, but still useful indicator of overall condition. Over generations, that could have turned mild preferences into pronounced sexual dimorphism. What's clear is that beard potential is universal. Humans everywhere carry the machinery, but its expression ranges from almost nothing to spectacular, both between individuals and across populations. That variation hints that cultural and environmental selection kept tweaking the dial in different directions. Step back now and look at the body as a whole. Human groups living in different climates show systematic differences in hair patterning. Some populations tend to have more noticeable body hair on the torso and limbs. Others have very sparse visible hair outside the head and pubic regions. Scalp hair varies in average thickness, density and curvature. Eyebrows can be heavy or delicate, beards luxuriant or patchy. Much of this seems to be polygenic, controlled by many genes, each contributing a small effect, and responsive to both climate and cultural history. In colder environments, where clothing became thick and constant, the selective pressure on body hair as insulation might have relaxed, allowing drift and local preferences to play a bigger role. In hotter climates, where sweating stayed crucial, sparse body hair could remain advantageous, while dense scalp hair and dark pigmentation defended against the sun. Layered on top of climate came culture. Norms about shaving or plucking, hair wrapping or cutting, associations between hair and purity, adulthood or social rank. Cultural practices themselves can feed back into biology. If for thousands of years a society prefers less facial hair and mates choose accordingly, the underlying genetic distribution can slowly shift. Yet beneath all this variation, the map is recognizably the same. A thick crown on the head, guarding the brain. Brows and lashes guarding the eyes, doubling as emotional signposts. Coarse, hormone-dependent hair in the armpits and groin, linked to scent, friction, and sexual maturity. Potential for facial hair in males, sitting at the intersection of status and attraction. And across the rest of the body, a whisper of vellus hair, the ghost of a coat that once was. Our hair didn't simply vanish, it specialized. Each surviving island tells a piece of the story, how our ancestors traded fur for sweat, insulation for communication, passive protection for active culture. And just beneath those strands, the skin itself was changing too, thickening, pigmenting, learning to live almost naked under an open sky. Skin is often treated as background, a neutral backdrop for hair, for clothes, for all the more obvious features we use to recognize each other. But once the fur coat started thinning, skin stopped being background, it moved to center stage. When our ancestors stepped fully into the sun with most of their body exposed, they weren't just altering their appearance. They were rewriting one of the most important interfaces between organism and environment on Earth. Hair and skin began to co-evolve. You can't pull insulation off a body without changing how that body handles heat, light, and chemistry. As hair retreated, sunlight that used to get tangled and scattered in fur began striking bare epidermis directly. That meant more ultraviolet radiation hitting the cells that divide, heal, and make the building blocks of your tissue. Evolution answered with pigment. Deep in the lower layers of the epidermis, some cells began working overtime. Melanocytes. Their job is simple and profound. Manufacture melanin and pass it to neighboring skin cells, like handing out millions of microscopic umbrellas. Melanin doesn't just color the skin, it's a physical and chemical shield. Ultraviolet photons slam into melanin granules and get absorbed, deflected, or turned into harmless heat before they can punch holes in DNA. Without that shield, UV rays can create mutations, twists and breaks in the genetic script that lead to cancers. In a fur-covered primate, much of the skin is already in shade. In a mostly naked primate, suddenly it isn't. The result, according to most researchers, was strong selection for darkly pigmented skin in early humans living under equatorial sun. In that environment, year-round UV is intense. Too much unfiltered radiation doesn't just raise skin cancer risk. It threatens something even more fundamental: folate. Folate, a B vitamin, is crucial for building new cells, and especially for forming a healthy fetus. UV light can break it down in the bloodstream. Individuals with very light, unprotected skin in high UV zones would have had more trouble maintaining folate levels, more miscarriages, more developmental problems, fewer surviving children. Dark melanin-rich skin acts like armor against that folate destruction. So as hair fell away and sweating ramped up, the most successful bodies in the ancestral tropics were those that married two traits: sparse fur for cooling and heavily pigmented skin for protection. A naked coat, but not a vulnerable one. The story could have ended there. A species of dark-skinned, mostly hairless primates thriving in Africa, optimized for sun and sweat. But our ancestors didn't stay put. They moved. As some human groups began pushing into higher latitudes, the relationship with sunlight changed. UV wasn't always a threat anymore. It became, in some seasons, a scarce and precious resource. Under the skin, another quiet chemical story was unfolding. Vitamin D. Your body can make vitamin D when UVB light strikes cholesterol-related molecules in the skin. Vitamin D isn't a minor optional nutrient. It's essential for calcium absorption, bone health, immune function, and more. In places where the sun is lower in the sky for much of the year, and where days grow short and dim in winter, UVB becomes limited. Now the same melanin that protected equatorial ancestors could become a liability. Too much pigment, too little light, and vitamin D synthesis drops. In severe cases, children develop rickets, soft, misshapen bones that can make walking and childbirth difficult or deadly. One way around this is diet. Fish, marine mammals, certain animal fats rich in vitamin D. Another way is architectural, building lives around the coasts, following herds. But for populations inland, with variable diets and long winters, another solution emerges in the genetic record: lighter skin. The vitamin D hypothesis suggests that as humans migrated out of Africa into Eurasia, natural selection slowly favored variants that reduced melanin density in the skin. Less pigment meant more UVB getting through in weak northern sunlight, boosting vitamin D production enough to maintain strong bones and healthy pregnancies. The pattern isn't perfectly simple. There are many genes involved, different histories, and local diets, but across the globe a broad trend shows up. Where UV is high and stable, darker, more protective skin predominates. Where UV is low or highly seasonal, lighter skin colours become more common, especially in inland populations with limited vitamin D sources. What began as a universal dark shield in a naked tropical primate fractured into a spectrum of adaptations tuned to latitude, clouds, altitude, and culture. Underneath all that variation, this same organ kept refining itself in other ways. Human skin is not just a tarp stretched over muscle and bone. It's a living, dynamic system with several extraordinary tricks. First, sweating. Most mammals that sweat do so in a patchy, limited way. Humans are covered, almost head to toe, in eccrine sweat glands. They can pump out watery fluid in astonishing volumes, especially in the heat. Each droplet that evaporates pulls heat away from the skin. Multiply that by millions of glands, and you get a cooling system so effective that a lightly built human can jog in midday heat that would send many other large mammals into collapse. Our nearly hairless skin makes this possible. Less fur means more exposed surface for evaporation. Melanin keeps that surface from burning while it works. Second, healing. Human skin is built to repair itself under duress. Shallow cuts trigger cascades of clotting, immune response, and collagen rebuilding. Infections were a constant risk for our ancestors. An organism that can rapidly seal breaches gains a crucial edge. The same pigment cells that block UV may also help modulate inflammatory responses and scavenge free radicals. fine-tuning the balance between repair and runaway damage. Third, sensing. Beneath the surface, nerve endings branch like roots in soil. Some respond to the lightest brush of air, others to pressure, vibration, heat, or pain. Lose hair, and the skin has to take on even more of the job of feeling the world. Bare skin pressed against tree bark, stone, another person's hand. Each contact delivers a flood of information. Touch isn't just practical, it's social glue. The same sensory network that warns you of a thorn can also encode the comfort of a sleeping child against your chest, or the reassurance of another adult's hand on your shoulder during a storm. As human groups spread and diverged, this shared organ kept customizing itself. In equatorial Africa, richly pigmented skin shielded against relentless sun, often paired with tightly curled scalp hair that added another layer of shade. In deserts and high plateaus, darker skin defended against a double assault, strong UV from above and from light reflected off sand or snow. In northern forests and tundra, where the sky stayed low and meals changed with migrations and seasons, genetic variants that lightened skin spread through some populations, increasing vitamin D yield from fragile sunlight. Altitude carved its own signatures. In some high mountain groups, darker skin guarded against intensified UV at thinner atmosphere, while other adaptations, blood chemistry, lung capacity, handled the cold. Over tens of thousands of years, this created a human world map not of discrete races but of gradients, a continuous shifting mosaic where skin color changed gradually, with distance and environment, not in hard lines. Then culture stepped in and did what culture always does. It turned biology into symbolism. Once skin became reliably visible, no longer hidden under dense fur, humans began to mark it, modify it, and read it. Clay and ash rubbed onto the surface could change apparent color and offer extra sun protection, a kind of early sunscreen and camouflage in one. Plant dyes stained palms and soles. Soot and ochre traced patterns on faces and limbs. Later came intentional scarring, tattooing, piercing. Skin became a record of belonging and memory. Some marks signaled adulthood, others clan affiliation, social rank, personal achievements. In cold regions, where skin spent much of the year under layers of clothing, the visible parts, face, hands, became prime sites for cultural meaning. In hotter climates, where more of the body was exposed, the whole skin surface could serve as message board. The same pigments that once evolved to guard folate and DNA now shared space with mineral reds, plant blacks and indigo blues. The same sweat-wetted surface that cooled hunters on the Savanna also gleamed in ritual dances, glowed by firelight, carried perfumes and smoke. What started as a functional response to a lost fur coat darkened the surface, strengthened the barrier, spread the sweat glands, ended up giving our species one of its most expressive canvases. Every shade, every freckle, every line tells threads of that deep story. The equatorial sun that forged our first dark skins, the northern winters that lightened others, the deserts and coasts and mountains that bent the spectrum into countless local solutions, and layered on top, the cultural inks and scars and paints that turn necessity into art. Beneath all of it, though, the skin is still doing its ancient jobs, guarding, cooling, feeling, a living boundary between the inner world of cells and the outer world of climate and contact, and we weren't the only mammals to travel this path toward nakedness and specialized skin. Others shed their fur and reinvented their coverings too, for very different reasons. Comparing their stories to ours reveals just how many ways evolution can arrive at a naked body, and how human hairlessness is only one point in a much larger pattern. Compared to most mammals, we look like we're missing something obvious, but we're not alone. If you step back and look across the tree of life, you find other bodies that made a similar trade. Less fur, more exposed skin, New ways of dealing with heat, light, and touch. Start with the giants. Elephants, for example, are mostly naked if you ignore the sparse bristles. A newborn elephant isn't wrapped in a plush coat. Its skin shows thick and wrinkled, more like a living landscape than a pelt. Their reasons are not our reasons. An elephant is a massive furnace of muscle and blood. Volume produces heat, surface area sheds it. Big bodies trap warmth. Cover that bulk in dense hair under an African sun, and you've built a walking heat stroke. So instead, evolution did something clever. It stripped most of the insulation away and turned the skin itself into a cooling system. Those deep wrinkles and cracks increase surface area. Water and mud cling to them, slowing evaporation, stretching every droplet into a longer, gentler release of heat. Sparse hair lets wind and shade actually touch the skin instead of getting stuck in a fluffy layer above it. Their mostly naked bodies are an answer to a very specific problem: how to keep a multi-ton animal from cooking. Rhinos followed a similar path. Thick armor-like skin, very little fur. Again, a huge herbivore in hot environments where dumping heat is a bigger priority than conserving it. A shaggy rhinoceros in the tropics wouldn't be majestic. It would be miserable. Then there are the mammals who went back to the water. Whales and dolphins are perhaps the most dramatic examples of hairlessness on Earth. Their ancestors were land-dwelling, four-legged, probably furry creatures. Over tens of millions of years they slid back into the oceans and kept going until their bodies barely resembled their terrestrial past. Fur doesn't work well underwater. On land, hair traps a layer of air, creating insulation. In water, that same air layer is stripped away, and hair becomes drag, tiny fibres tugged by every current. For an animal that needs to move efficiently through a dense medium, a smooth, hairless surface is gold. So whales traded fur for blubber. A thick layer of fat under the skin became their thermal blanket, while the skin itself grew sleek and almost frictionless. A hydrodynamic suit grown from the inside out. Here, hairlessness isn't about dumping heat. It's about moving through water like a blade. This is where some people see a parallel with humans and start to wonder, if aquatic mammals lost their fur and we lost most of ours, maybe we had an aquatic phase too. It's the emotional core of the aquatic ape idea. Smooth skin, diving abilities, fondness for shorelines, string them together and you get a tempting story. But when you look closely at whales, dolphins, seals, manatees and other aquatic mammals, a pattern emerges that does not quite fit us. Most fully aquatic mammals don't just lose fur, they re-engineer their entire bodies for water. Limbs turn into flippers, nostrils migrate, bones dense up, tails flatten into propulsion engines. Their hair loss is one part of a massive, obvious transformation. Humans never went that far. Our limbs are still built for walking and running. Our skeletons are terrestrial. Our lungs, sinuses and ears show no sign of having been redesigned for a life spent mostly underwater. Whatever love we have for coasts and rivers, our bones still read like the bones of land apes. Semi-aquatic mammals, the ones that split their time, tell a similar story. Otters keep dense fur because in their niche, hair is still useful insulation. Hippos have mostly bare skin, but theirs is thick, gland-rich, and secretes a kind of natural sunscreen. Again, a very specialized solution that doesn't quite map onto our own. So while our relative nakedness echoes the look of marine mammals, the deeper anatomical package suggests our path was different. Convergent in appearance, divergent in cause. To see just how many roots there are to naked, you can go smaller, stranger. Underground, in dry soils of East Africa, lives one of the oddest mammals on the planet, the naked mole rat. It looks like a pink, wrinkled sausage with teeth. Its hairlessness is not about sun or water or display. It's about tunnels. Naked mole rats spend almost their entire lives in elaborate burrow systems. Down there, temperatures are stable, light is nearly absent, wind never blows. A fur coat would trap dirt, snag in tight passageways, and provide little benefit. So, over evolutionary time, their fur withered away. What remained was smooth, flexible, almost translucent skin. Easy to squeeze through narrow tunnels, easy to keep clean in a world of soil and stone. But their story goes deeper than that. Naked mole rats are eusocial, living in colonies more like ants or bees than typical mammals. One breeding queen, many workers, dense populations, shared burrows, constant contact. You might expect that kind of living to be a paradise for skin infections and parasites. Yet naked mole rats show remarkable resistance to cancer and an unusual tolerance for low oxygen and high carbon dioxide. Their naked skin, their weird biology, and their social life are all tangled, each influencing the others. They are a reminder that hairlessness can evolve for reasons that have nothing to do with heat or beauty. Sometimes it's about friction. Sometimes it's about chemistry. Sometimes it's about living like an insect in a mammal's body. Line up all these naked or nearly naked creatures: elephants, rhinos, hippos, whales, dolphins, naked mole rats, us, and a pattern starts to emerge. Hairlessness keeps appearing, but only under very specific pressures. Huge body size in hot climates, where shedding heat is the priority. Fully aquatic life, where drag and insulation work differently. Subterranean life, where fur becomes a liability. Rare social and chemical environments, where hair might interfere with other adaptations. In each case, evolution solved a different puzzle with a similar visual outcome: less fur. This is convergent evolution, not a shared ancestry of nakedness, but multiple lineages, separated by millions of years, independently arriving at similar traits because they faced comparable constraints. When different mammals lose their fur, they almost never do it in exactly the same way. Elephants keep thick, cracked skin and a scattering of stiff hairs. Whales wrap their nakedness in fat and streamline every curve. Naked mole rats wrinkle and thin out, optimizing for life in the dark. Humans combine relatively thin skin, abundant sweat glands, pigment, and a peculiar patchwork of hair kept only in certain regions. Convergence gives us the headline, naked mammal, but the details carry the real story. It also shows us how unusual our path is. Hairlessness is rare in mammals because hair is, on balance, an excellent invention. It insulates, protects, senses, camouflages. It's cheap to grow and endlessly modifiable. To give it up, a lineage has to find itself in a very narrow set of conditions where the benefits of losing fur outweigh all those advantages. That doesn't happen often, which makes our own nakedness more striking. Whatever combination of pressures peeled our coat away, heat stress on the savanna, endurance running, parasites, social signaling, maybe brief flirtations with water, they must have been intense and lasting enough to overcome the default mammalian solution. Looking at other hairless mammals helps narrow the field. We see that large size plus heat can push fur away, but we never became elephant scale. We see that full aquatic life almost guarantees a sleek, hairless skin, but our bones insist we stayed mostly on land. We see that underground living can make hair unnecessary, but we turn toward open horizons and sky, not tunnels. So our story overlaps theirs but never perfectly matches. A little like their reasons, a lot unlike their shapes. Convergent evolution tells us something humble and comforting. We are not freaks of nature. We are not uniquely strange. We are one more experiment in how to live without a fur coat, one more body that decided to put skin directly in touch with the world and then had to reinvent how that skin worked. It also tells us that no single explanation was likely enough on its own. Other naked mammals usually have one overwhelming driver: water, massive size, burrows. Humans seem to sit at the intersection of many smaller pushes, all nudging our ancestors, generation after generation, toward a barer surface, a rare outcome, reached by a rare combination of paths. And that brings us back to ourselves. If elephants, whales, and naked mole rats each found their own route to near nakedness, maybe our smooth skin wasn't the result of a single grand moment, a plunge into the sea, a sudden climate shift, but a slow, braided process. Heat, parasites, social touch, attraction, tools, fire, clothing, brain power and culture all pulling in the same direction until one day an ape looked down and found more skin than fur. To understand that braid, we have to weave the threads together, not just compare them. That's where we turn next. If you ask most researchers today why we're naked apes, they don't point to a single cause. They point to a pile. Because when you pull on one thread of our hairlessness, the others move with it. Heat, movement, disease, attraction, technology, they're all tangled in the same knot. Start with the one that shows up almost everywhere in the evidence: heat. By the time our ancestors were spending a lot of time in more open habitats, patchy woodland and savanna, not endless forest, they were facing something new. Long stretches of direct sun, hot, still air, big, daily temperature swings. A furry primate that leaves the shade and starts walking out into that environment runs into a simple physics problem. If it can't dump heat fast enough, its brain cooks. One solution is obvious: thin the coat, let the skin breathe, and cover that skin in glands that can pour water out and let evaporation do the rest. Our bodies look like that kind of solution. We have more eccrine sweat glands per square inch than almost any other mammal. We start to sweat before we dangerously overheat. That's not just a side effect, that's a system. But sweating works best on bare skin. On a truly shaggy animal, sweat gets trapped in the fur, evaporates more slowly, and sometimes never quite reaches the air. If you want to turn your whole surface into a radiator, you get more cooling per drop of water if you cut the fur down. So imagine the early stages. Not a suddenly naked ape, just one with slightly shorter, thinner body hair, a little more air reaching the skin, a little more efficient sweating. Individuals with those traits stay active a bit longer in the heat, forage a bit further from shade, keep their brains running a bit cooler. Tiny advantages, paid out over generations. Now plug that into another piece of the puzzle: the way we move. Humans are bizarrely good at one very specific thing: running slowly for a long time in the heat. Compared to a gazelle or a cheetah, we're laughable sprinters, but line us up on a hot day and tell us to follow an antelope until one of us collapses, and the bet starts to look different. Quadrupeds overheat quickly when they're pushed at a trot or canter in direct sun. They pant to cool off, and panting doesn't work well when you have to keep breathing deeply to run. We, on the other hand, can decouple breathing from stride. We can shed heat through sweat from almost our entire surface. We can carry water. We can track. This is the core of the endurance running and persistence hunting idea, that some of our ancestors hunted not by pouncing, but by pursuing. Not in a dramatic final sprint, but in a long, relentless pressure that ends with an exhausted animal that simply can't get up. You don't need every hominin everywhere to do this for it to matter. You only need enough of them, often enough for natural selection to notice. In that scenario, hairlessness plus sweating isn't just staying cool, it's a weapon. The less hair on your body, the more efficiently you can offload heat, the longer you can keep moving without your organs protesting. The longer you keep moving, the more likely you are to bring down protein and fat-rich food in the middle of the day, when other predators are resting in the shade. Those calories rebuild muscles, they feed brains, they support pregnancies and childhoods, they turn into grandchildren, and so the loop tightens. Better thermoregulation makes endurance possible. Endurance makes midday hunting and long-distance foraging profitable. Success at those strategies favours even better thermoregulation. Hair thins, sweat glands proliferate. Bodies and behaviours adjust to a life lived partly in the furnace of the afternoon. At the same time, another quieter force is working alongside these practical advantages: preference. Sexual selection doesn't invent traits from scratch. It amplifies what's already there. Once a little more bare skin becomes common enough, it becomes visible. It can become meaningful. Imagine a population where losing body hair is slightly helpful for staying cool, but not yet critical. Differences between individuals are small. Some are hairier, some less so. Now add social brains that are always ranking, evaluating, noticing. Add the early stirrings of aesthetic sense. Maybe smoother skin looks healthier because it shows fewer parasites. Maybe it shows off underlying muscle tone, or signals youth, or simply stands out in a way that brains find interesting. Whatever the reason, if members of one sex tend to choose partners with slightly less body hair, those partners' genes spread faster. Now you have two engines instead of one. Natural selection favouring hairlessness for functional reasons, sexual selection favouring it for social reasons. Each amplifies the other. A trait that starts as a survival tweak can, under the pressure of mate choice, sweep through a population much more quickly than survival alone would demand. You can start to sketch a rough timeline. Early on, in more forested, shaded environments, a full fur coat is still mostly a good thing. Then climates shift, habitats open, and more of our ancestors begin covering ground in the sun. Slight reductions in hair and increases in sweating are favoured because they help with thermoregulation during daytime activity. As those changes accumulate, over hundreds of thousands of years, not overnight, persistent-style hunting becomes more and more feasible. Our ancestors aren't just foraging hot, they're weaponizing heat against other animals. Hairlessness in that world is a performance-enhancing trait. Around the same time, or not long after, ectoparasites are having their say. Ticks, lice, fleas, biting flies, all of them thrive in dense fur. In warm climates with growing group sizes and more sleeping sites reused again and again, parasites are everywhere. They sap energy, spread disease, and make life miserable. Less body hair means fewer hiding places for them. It makes grooming more efficient and social delousing more effective. Individuals and groups who are slightly less hairy may carry lower parasite loads, suffer fewer infections, and rear more healthy offspring. That's another push in the same direction. By now, bare or nearly bare skin is a normal part of the ancestral landscape. It's visible in courtship. It's part of ritual touch. It's tied in a fuzzy emotional way to health, comfort, and the absence of itching and sores. Sexual selection catches hold and begins to amplify fine details, smoothness, tone, maybe even particular patterns of leftover hair. Layer on one more change: technology. Somewhere in this long arc our ancestors learned to use fire regularly. They start sleeping near flames. They begin to drape themselves in skins and plant fibres. Those behaviours break the old rule that body hair has to do all the insulating work. Once you can put warmth on and take it off, you're less locked into a permanent fur coat. Selection pressure to keep thick body hair for cold nights eases, while the pressure to be efficient in daytime heat remains. Clothing and fire don't start the process, but they may let it continue further than it otherwise could have. What emerges from all this is a network of feedback loops. Hairlessness improves sweating. Sweating improves endurance. Endurance improves hunting success and foraging range. That success feeds brains, which invent fire, clothing, tools, and social rules. Those cultural tools reduce some of the old costs of losing fur, like nighttime chill, while leaving the benefits in place. At the same time, less hair reduces parasites. Fewer parasites mean better health, and perhaps a cleaner canvas for visual signals. that cleaner, smoother canvas becomes part of what individuals find attractive. Attraction, in turn, pushes the population further down the path that heat and parasites opened. Each loop makes the next one stronger. If this all sounds neat and tidy, it probably wasn't. Real evolution is messy. Traits rise and fall. Different populations take different paths. Some may have stayed hairier for longer, especially in cooler or shadier environments. Others may have gone nearly naked early, then adapted with culture rather than biology when climates changed. And there are gaps. We still don't know exactly when our ancestors crossed the line from hairy ape to mostly hairless ape. Hair doesn't fossilize. We infer from skin impressions, from the evolution of lice, from genetic changes in keratin and sweat gland genes, from comparisons with other primates and mammals. The timelines we build are careful reconstructions, not direct recordings. We don't know how much each factor contributed, or whether some were crucial in one region and minor in another. The story could be different for populations near coasts, in river corridors, on high plateaus, in dense woodland edges. It probably was. Ongoing research keeps nudging the picture into sharper focus. Geneticists look for signatures of selection in genes related to hair growth, pigmentation, and sweat. Paleoanthropologists re-examine fossils for clues about climate and behavior. Biomechanists test how human bodies manage heat during running in real landscapes. Entomologists map the family tree of lice to pin down when body lice specializing in clothing first appeared. Each new line of evidence adds a brushstroke rather than overturning the whole canvas. For now, the simplest reading of all that data is not that one grand cause stripped us, but that many smaller pressures leaned together. We walked into the sun, we ran and kept running. We itched and scratched and groomed. We chose partners whose bodies signaled health and comfort. We wrapped ourselves in firelight and hides when day was done. And across all those choices, over unimaginable stretches of time, our fur quietly thinned away, leaving us with a strange inheritance, a naked skin that doesn't just cover us but defines how we move, hunt, touch, and see each other. From here, the story shifts again, because once that bare skin existed, culture began to paint on it, literally and figuratively. How we feel about hair, how we remove it, grow it, hide it, celebrate it, that's no longer just biology. That's history, fashion, identity, and that's where we go next. By the time written history begins, our nakedness is already old news to biology, but to culture it's brand new territory. Because once bare skin is the default, hair stops being just insulation and starts becoming a signal, something you can shape, remove, display, hide, something that can mean status, piety, rebellion, cleanliness, sexuality, or nothing at all, depending on where and when you happen to be born. If you could time travel through human history with just one question, what do you do with your body hair? You'd get an astonishing variety of answers. In ancient Mesopotamia, some elites seem to have prized a smooth, groomed body. Clay tablets and art show carefully styled beards on men, but less emphasis on visible body hair elsewhere. The message wasn't natural is best, it was controlled is best. Hair, on the face, on the head, was something to be managed, not just worn. In ancient Egypt, they took that idea and turned it up several notches. The Nile climate was hot, humid, full of insects and disease. In that world, shaving wasn't just a style choice, it was a hygiene technology. Archaeological finds include razors made of copper and bronze, tweezers, depilatory pastes. Many Egyptians shaved their heads and bodies, then put on elaborate wigs and headdresses for public life. Priests in particular were expected to be almost completely hairless. Ritual purity meant no stray hairs, no lice, nothing that smacked of wildness. Hair removal became part of the rhythm of temple life, as routine as washing. To them, a shaved body didn't look unnatural, it looked civilized. Head west, across the Mediterranean, and you hit a different pattern. In ancient Greece, body hair was wrapped up with ideas of maturity, beauty, and self-control. Statues of young male athletes are often shown with smooth torsos and limbs, even though real Greek men would have had some hair. Whether this was artistic idealization or a reflection of grooming habits, it tells you something about what they thought looked good. Women, in many Greek and later Roman sources, are described as removing at least some body hair, especially from the legs and pubic region, using pumice stones, resins, or early waxing techniques. At the same time, a full beard on a man could signal wisdom or philosophical seriousness, while a completely smooth face might suggest youth or softness. Hair was a code. Everyone could read it. Not everyone agreed on what it should say. Move east into ancient India, and the story shifts again. Hindu and Jain traditions have long treated hair as spiritually significant. Ascetics might let hair grow wild as a sign of renunciation, or remove it completely in ritual shaving to symbolize detachment from ego and worldly identity. In some Buddhist traditions, the act of shaving the head marks entry into monastic life, a visible surrender of vanity. Here, hair isn't just fashion. It's theology, ethics, metaphysics made visible on the scalp and skin. Across the Islamic world, texts and law schools developed detailed guidelines about which hairs should be trimmed, which removed, which left alone. Removing pubic and underarm hair came to be associated with cleanliness and religious propriety, beards with masculinity and faith. What started, in evolutionary deep time, as a trade-off between parasites and thermoregulation becomes, thousands of generations later, a matter of personal piety and identity. Even the tools echo our past. Where our ancestors once picked through one another's fur for lice, later generations plucked eyebrows, threaded facial hair, sugared legs. Grooming stayed social. It just changed targets. But not every culture took the same path. In many indigenous societies around the world, traditional attitudes toward body hair were far more relaxed. Among some groups in the Americas and Oceania, little attention was paid to removing hair beyond occasional plucking or singeing for comfort or ritual. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, dense body hair was relatively uncommon to begin with, thanks to genetic variation, so the question was less pressing. In East Asia, where many populations naturally have finer and sparser body hair, historical records often focus more on head hairstyles than on whether arms or legs should be shaved. The body's relative smoothness was simply a given, not a project. If you zoom out, you start to see a pattern. The same biology, roughly the same distribution of follicles, the same mostly hairless canvas, gets read through wildly different cultural lenses. Sometimes hair equals purity, sometimes it equals pollution, sometimes it equals adulthood, sometimes animality, sometimes it's eroticized, sometimes it's desexualized, and all of that is layered on top of something older and quieter, our primate brains still tuned to notice skin. Modern beauty standards, especially in industrialized societies, have taken that noticing and turned it into a global industry. In Europe and North America, the 19th and early 20th centuries saw a major shift. For much of earlier European history, women's limbs were covered by long skirts and sleeves. What hair existed there was mostly invisible in public. Then fashion changed. Hemlines rose, sleeves shortened, bathing suits shrank. Suddenly, leg and underarm hair that had been private became visible, and almost immediately it became a problem to be solved. Advertising campaigns in the early 1900s began to frame women's underarm hair as unsightly and unfeminine. razors and depilatory creams were marketed as solutions to a flaw that, a generation earlier, almost no one was thinking about. Smooth skin was sold as modern, hygienic, desirable. Hairlessness, already part of our evolutionary story, was rebranded as a moral and aesthetic obligation, but only for certain bodies in certain places. Men's grooming followed, more slowly. Beards waxed and waned in popularity. In some eras, a clean-shaven face and neatly trimmed hair signalled professionalism. In others, a full beard signalled ruggedness or rebellion. In recent decades, male body hair, from chest to back to legs, has also come under the razor and the wax strip, especially in media tied to fitness and fashion. At the same time, other cultures have maintained or revived very different standards. In some communities, thick facial hair is still a key sign of masculinity and religious commitment. In others, women increasingly reject the expectation to remove body hair, framing regrowth not as a lapse but as an act of autonomy. Online, you can find spaces that celebrate body hair of all kinds, alongside spaces that meticulously instruct you on how to eliminate every last strand. Our species spent hundreds of thousands of years gradually losing its fur, mostly by accident of survival and preference. Now we spend time and money replaying that process in miniature on our own bodies, week by week, with razor blades, lasers, waxes, and creams. What does that say about us? At one level, it reveals how tightly social meaning clings to visible traits. Evolution carved our skin into a high-resolution display. Colour, texture, scars, tattoos, muscles shifting under the surface. It stripped away most of the fuzz that would have blurred those signals. Culture, given that blanker slate, can't resist writing on it. We turn follicles into fashion statements. We turn ancient parasite defences into modern spa treatments. At another level, our obsession with body hair shows how uncomfortable we can be with the parts of ourselves that remind us we're animals. Hair is a link to our furry past. It grows on its own schedule. It sprouts in places we don't always expect or want. We can trim it, pluck it, burn it, but we can't negotiate with it. It keeps coming back like a quiet, persistent reminder. You are not made, you are grown. For some, removing that reminder feels like control. For others, keeping it feels like honesty. And under all the cultural noise, the biology hasn't changed much. We still sweat through bare skin to cool our big, active brains. We still rely on clothing and shelter instead of fur to keep warm. We still carry the same genes that once tilted the balance toward nakedness in a hot, parasite-ridden world. The rest, the rules about what hair is acceptable on which body, in which decade, in which social group, that's all recent improvisation. A thin, shifting layer of fashion laid over a very old mammalian story. If you could line up your distant, shaggy ancestors beside you, they would probably stare in puzzlement at your razor or your wax strip, your beard oil or your laser clinic brochure. But step past the tools, look at the bodies themselves, and the continuity would be obvious. They walked under the sun and their hair thinned. You walk under electric lights and your hair obeys the same quiet genes. We are, in one sense, as far as it's possible to be from those early apes, living in cities wrapped in fabrics from the other side of the planet, arguing online about eyebrow thickness and beard shape. In another sense, we are exactly what they were becoming, a naked primate whose skin has become a canvas for climate, for selection, for culture, for personal choice. From here, there's just one question left. Now that we understand a little more about how we lost our fur and how we've spent millennia reacting to that loss, what do we do with that knowledge? How do we live inside this strange hair-like body we inherited? That's where we'll end, with the naked truth we carry every day in our own skin. So here you are. Not as an abstract diagram in a textbook, not as a fossil in a museum drawer, but as the current endpoint of a story that started long before there were humans, or apes, or even mammals. A story where a small primate lineage edged out onto the branches, then down to the ground. Where thick fur that once sheltered tiny nocturnal bodies slowly thinned under a brutal sun. Where sweat glands multiplied, parasites bit, partners chose, fires burned, clothes wrapped shoulders, and genes drifted and were pruned again and again by the quiet scissors of natural selection. Somewhere along that path, we stopped being animals wrapped in fur and became animals wrapped in ideas. Ideas about what bare skin should mean. Ideas about which hairs to keep and which to shave, pluck, braid, or bless. Ideas about modesty, purity, masculinity, femininity, professionalism, rebellion, beauty, disgust, pride. But underneath all of it, the evolutionary story is still there. Our hairlessness isn't a gimmick, it's not a mistake. It's a multi-layered adaptation, hammered out over millions of years by heat and drought and disease and preference, then refined by technology and culture and personal choice. Losing our fur did 3 remarkable things. It changed our bodies. Bare skin and efficient sweating turned us into long-distance endurance machines, able to run down prey and survive in open, hostile landscapes. Thinner hair made parasites easier to control, wounds easier to see, touch more direct and precise. It nudged our metabolism, our growth, our sleep, our need for shelter. It changed our brains. Once your body stops insulating you like a walking coat, you have to get clever. You have to learn to use fire, sew hides, build shelters, remember where water is, coordinate with others, communicate about dangers that your skin now directly feels. Hairlessness didn't create intelligence, but it linked survival more tightly to planning, cooperation, and imagination. And it changed our relationships. Skin became a social surface, a place to show health, emotion, group identity, even belief, a place to be touched, to be healed, to be decorated, a place where culture could write its symbols in scars, tattoos, paint, fabrics, and yes, in hair, present or absent. You carry all of that right now without having to think about it. When you notice a breeze on your arm, that's the legacy of fur that isn't there anymore. When you sweat on a hot day and feel the air cool you, that's a trick your distant ancestors traded their coats for. When you pull on a shirt or a sweater or wrap yourself in a blanket to sleep, you're finishing the job that evolution started and culture took over, replacing fur with fabric, instinct with invention. And the mystery isn't finished. Scientists are still arguing, kindly and not so kindly, about which pressures mattered most. Was it thermoregulation on the Savanna, parasites in dense social groups, sexual selection for smooth, visible skin, a side effect of changes in growth and brain development, something we haven't even thought of yet? The honest answer is, it was probably many things at different times and different places. Our nakedness isn't a single eureka moment. It's a long, overlapping tangle of causes and consequences, a slow, quiet transformation that only looks sudden when you compress a few million years into one evening story. And that, maybe, is the most human part of all this. We are always tempted to want one reason, one clean explanation, one theory to rule them all. But our bodies tell a different tale, a layered, messy, contingent history where every trait is a compromise, every advantage costs something, and every solution opens new problems to solve. So when you look at your own skin, the hair that's there, the hair that isn't, the places you choose to change it, and the places you leave it alone, you're not just seeing you in a narrow modern sense. You're seeing a summary of deserts crossed and forests left behind, of fires tended in cold nights, of lovers' preferences whispered across countless generations, of lice picked and fleas crushed, of tools sharpened, clothes stitched, shelters built, of choices made under skies your ancestors thought would last forever. You are, in that quiet way, an answer to a very old question. What happens if a primate bets its survival on knowledge, cooperation, and bare skin? Apparently, this. Humans on a small planet, listening to stories about their own bodies through tiny speakers and glowing screens, wondering how they got this way. If this journey through our naked past has kept you company tonight, or sparked a thought you hadn't had before, you can help this channel keep exploring questions like this. If you'd like to, you can tap like. It tells the algorithms that slow, thoughtful history is worth showing to other people who might need a gentle voice and a curious story. You can subscribe if you'd like to wander further down the strange paths of human evolution and ancient history with us in future nights. There's a whole universe of mysteries left. Why we dream the way we do, how we learn to count, what it really means to be civilized. If you feel like sharing a small piece of your own story, you're warmly invited to leave a comment and tell us where you're listening from. A bedroom in a crowded city, a quiet farmhouse, a dorm room, a night shift break room, a tiny apartment with thin walls and a heavy day behind you. All of those places are now, improbably, connected by language, by technology, by the same long, hair-thinning evolutionary road. And if you ever want to support this work a little more directly, there's an option here on YouTube to join as a channel member. It's completely optional, only if and when it feels right for you. Watching, resting, learning, that's already more than enough. For now, you don't have to do anything at all. You can just notice the quiet weight of your body, the feel of fabric on your skin, the places where a few stubborn hairs catch the light, and the larger spaces where there is only soft, warm living surface. This is your inheritance. A naked primate, wrapped in stories, breathing slowly in the dark. The same skin that once faced down African suns now rests under a ceiling, under a roof, under a sky that has seen all of this before. Let the questions drift to the edges of your mind. Let the deep time settle around you, like a blanket you didn't know you had. You're here at the end of a very long journey and at the quiet beginning of tomorrow. Sleep well in the body evolution gave you. Sleep well in your own naked truth.